Good evening and welcome to TARZAN's Take. In a departure from our normal programming format, we continue from last week's discussion of from handouts to handshakes. Last week, we heard the views of two agencies that deliver aid. The European Union, representing the multilateral type of aid, told us about what goes into their consideration and what they actually do in terms of giving aid to Ghana and Africa. The African Evaluation Association, represented by Mr. Brymer, gave us a 15-year experience of how NGOs facilitate the giving of aid and what they consider the most important aspects of the aid business and their partnership with Ghana and the rest of Africa. Tonight, we want to hear the experiences of two Ghanaians who spent considerable time working in the international development business. Our first guest is Mr. Albert David Osei, a Ghanaian who spent more than 30 years of his working life with the World Bank Group. And our second guest is Dr. Yao Graham, who, from the time of his inception, has been the coordinator of the Third World Network Africa. We will first of all hear the views of Mr. Osei, who worked as the bank and rose to the positions of country director for many countries and also country director for the IFC in many other countries. Then we'll move on to Dr. Yao Graham, who, as I said, as the foundation coordinator of the Third World Network in Africa. They are a think tank that looks at the whole of the international development business and sees what is good about it for Ghana and Africa, and what we should be careful of when we agree to accept aid. Welcome again to TARZAN's Take, and to the second and concluding part of From Handouts to Handshakes. Good evening.
Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever.
In 1957, our founding father, Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, led the Gold Coast to become Ghana, Black Africa's first European colony to become a free and independent modern nation state. This precipitated a wind of change which blew like tsunami through Africa, culminating in South Africa's independence in 1994.
I, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, do hereby swear to be faithful to the Republic of South Africa. So help me God. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
Right from the word go, Nkrumah and the new leaders of Africa were determined to show that the independence was not a mere rhetoric, but was the platform from which a strong and united Africa will emerge and rub shoulders as equal partners with their ex-colonial masters and the entire global community.
There is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that, after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.
Forward then to independence. To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
Unfortunately and most regrettably, Africa has failed to realize the dream and the promise of being able to look after its own business and has returned to a voluntary neo-colonialist system, given the charitable name of International Development Partnership. Africa today has once again become the white man's burden. Every aspect of our daily lives, from putting food on our tables, to building the infrastructure that moves us around, to curing basic ills and life-threatening diseases, all and more have become the burdens of the white man, now aided by some of the continent's own brightest and best talents.
And in the air, the fireflies are only light in paradise. Show the world they were wrong and teach them all to sing along. Sing it, man, I'm alive, I'm alive. Sing it, man, I am alive. We are the children. We are the ones who make a brighter day. So let's start giving.
International development aid has become an industry in itself, employing and deploying millions of people, including many capable Africans who make very successful careers from running the daily lives of Africans. There is an increasing realization that the aid is retarding Africa's development and that it is time for a new order of international economic relations built on Africans taking charge of their own affairs and making real and manifest the true meaning of their political independence, namely, to take charge of their own affairs and fulfill the promises they made to their people when they seek their mandates at elections.
Until homegrown development does come along. But I don't think the West is going to achieve the end of poverty in Africa like Jeff Sachs does. I think Africans are going to achieve the end of poverty in a homegrown way. Africans are going to save themselves. It's not going to be Jeff Sachs that saves Africa. It's not going to be Bono that saves Africa. It's not going to be Bob Geldof that saves Africa. It's going to be Africans that save Africa.
Concerts raised millions of dollars from ordinary people around the world and marked the beginning of a new era of celebrity saviours who've been growing in authority, number and influence ever since. Enter African economist and author Dambisa Moyo, billed as the anti-Bono and with a provocative book called Dead Aid, a stinging critique of the so-called glamour aid. Moyo argues aid is not a solution, it's the problem.
I don't agree with the message. Fundamentally, I don't think Africa needs more aid. I think it needs less aid. It needs governments to be made accountable to the domestic citizenry and not accountable to donors. Africans stand in the hot African sun to elect their leaders. And it's those leaders who are charged with the responsibility of delivering social services and being accountable to their people. There clearly was a vacuum that has allowed the celebrity culture to seep in, but it would seem to me that no society would appreciate their whole policy and the future of their children to be dependent on celebrities that actually don't live in these contexts. The African on the ground, I'm wondering what options they have to bring their governments to accountability.
I suspect many people watching this program would say the problem's not aid, it's corrupt leaders.
Right. I don't think you can delink the two in the African context. I think an aid model makes good leaders bad and makes bad leaders worse.
All day down, 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 shoot it all down.
Albert, you've worked for the World Bank Group for more than 30 years. In that time, you have risen to positions of country director both at the main bank group and at the IFC. From your experience, what do you consider to have been the main pluses and the negatives of the relationships between the bank, Ghana, and Africa?
The pluses, the World Bank is a repository of knowledge. I mean, it's not a mark of unusual praise. If you lend, let's say, 50 to 60 times to countries which have similar situations, you accumulate knowledge. You know what works and what doesn't work. And in Ghana's relations with the World Bank, that is what one would hope Ghana can take away. What is it that they know that we might not know? Where has it worked? What's their experience? So it's the intellectual capital of the World Bank rather than its financial resources, which is the most useful thing for countries like Ghana to tap into. So that's the big plus. Now, the second plus is the financial. There are not many places where you can find financing on the terms that the World Bank offered Ghana until literally this month. We could borrow from what was called the IDA, International Development Association, which is a sub group within the World Bank group. And in those days, they were offering money at less than 1%, 0.75%. And it was for 75 years in some instances, in most instances. Now, you know, development requires resources. And if you want to find out where the money is, so to speak, think of the world as being resources as lying in one of four quadrants. If you divide the world, the source of finance, into two kinds, domestic and foreign, and private and public, and you try to imagine where the funds really are that you need for development, therefore that you should tap into, the biggest source is foreign and private. The next to that comes foreign again, but public. And that's where the World Bank belongs. You don't look at domestic, either public or private, simply because on the public side, Ghana has never, in my experience, run a clear budget deficit. Sometimes you get a primary budget deficit, which simply means that if you exclude interest payments, then in that period of time, the country's revenues exceeded its expenditures. This has been virtually unknown, so you don't go to the domestic, you don't look to the domestic public source of financing. And so that is the second advantage. You can get money on good terms from there. And the reason why the terms are good is because the richest members of the World Bank Group act as guarantors for the money we borrow. Now, for me, those are the two biggest pluses: intellectual capital, financial resources, and good terms. What are the negatives? Personally, and this is from my experience, the biggest negative is that there is a tendency for bureaucracies to uniformize how they deal with everybody. One size fits all. And because of that, there have been disastrous interventions, really disastrous. They assume that they know, and they assume that what worked in country A will work in Ghana. They assume that the Ghanaians don't know, and therefore that's what leads to sometimes irritating remarks from people in places like Ghana that the World Bank dictates to them. A second negative of the World Bank, in my view, has been that there is what is called transaction costs. If I want to lend you money, I have to There are so many things I want to do, especially if I'm at the World Bank, before I do it. And then even after we've agreed, if you start trying to change it, it's difficult to get the World Bank's approval. So you have to think very hard which sectors, which projects you want the World Bank to be involved in. If they don't know it, don't get them involved. You know, since I've been retired, I have worked a little bit for the government of Ghana, and I worked mostly on public sector reform. I don't think many people will believe me if I told them that the monies loaned to Ghana or granted to Ghana for public sector reform as of now must exceed $400 million US. What did we end up with the public sector? Who is happy with the public sector today? They can't produce. They don't produce. When people go to work in the morning and you go to them with a problem, they invent a solution. A good bureaucracy means that the guy doesn't have to invent his job every morning. There should be a procedure that is known. When people go to any government agency, 90% of the time the thing they seek is information. They don't want money. They want information that's reliable and up to date. Try and get information. The World Bank, I think, has overlooked this aspect of it, which is that they should insist on knowledge and experience in the countries that they work with. Because, to put it bluntly, we lie to each other. The World Bank lies to the country, and the country lies right back. Can you do this? The World Bank should know they can do it. And the World Bank should ask itself if it really needs that to be done for the project to work well. That's why monitoring and evaluation in the course of a project is so important. And the ability, when you find out you're doing the wrong thing, the ability to recognize it and to stop it before it does much harm. If you don't, and it is used to evaluate you as to whether you're doing it, who gains? The World Bank feels irritated. They never do what they say. You feel irritated. They don't disburse their money. That is bad.
Again, drawing from your experience, there must be areas in which more benefits can arise from the cooperation between the bank and Ghana. But what we seem to see is that the bank and Ghana are trying to intervene or collaborate in every single sphere of our development. How do you think we should prioritize the relationship to ensure that we can focus on those areas that we think the bank's repository of experience will coincide with our most important needs so that we can achieve a synergy of output for both sides?
I think the World Bank should pay most attention to what I call capacity development. At the end of the day, in Ghana, it's not money that is the biggest constraint. It is managing things. It is managing things efficiently. And the World Bank's experience in this area, even though it might be the area that has the most troublesome transaction costs you have to discuss the most, it is also the area that is most likely to yield you maximum benefits. And the one thing I will disrecommend very, very much is what the World Bank has gotten into more and more. They say if we agree with what your budget is like, we'll support the budget. Well, the record of people doing what is in their budget is dismal, dismal. And again, there more than anywhere else, the World Bank will insist that, if you say that you're going to have an economic policy that will give you single-digit inflation. Well, single-digit inflation is not obtained free of charge. You lose something in trying to hold back inflation. So I strongly believe in financing capacity building attached to specific projects, investment projects. So that, for example, if you want to help the fisheries sector, in addition to financing landing places and so on, you also make an effort to train people who can do the inspection of fish if we want to export it. Sometimes that has been a major block. So I disagree with budgetary support unless it is absolutely necessary. And the second reason why I disagree with it is that the IMF, instead of the World Bank, is best placed to do that. Is better placed to do that. And they should be allowed to do their job. And the World Bank's money should go to capacity building, social infrastructure, education, and so on and so forth.
Last but not the least, do you think that it will ever be possible, or there will be a day when the relationship between the bank and Ghana, and indeed the whole of Africa, will move from one of you giving handouts to a relationship in which the bank and Ghana operate as equal economic partners within the remit of the normal relationship between a lender and a borrower, which is expected to be on fair and equitable grounds, but also the basis that the borrower will do everything to ensure that what they borrow is paid back in full and not written off as is happening now?
Yes, it is possible. And not only is it possible, some countries have reached and even exceeded that stage. If you take Korea in the beginning, after the Korean War, very, very, very early on, the Koreans and the World Bank agreed to restrict the number of areas that they would collaborate in. They would borrow from the World Bank for. I think Ghana should do the same at some point. Make sure that you go to them for the things they do best. Now they are doing all kinds of things which either we don't need their help, or their help might even turn out to be a hindrance because they don't know the context very well. The other day I heard somebody say that the Kwame Nkrumah Circle overpass, they're doing that instead of finishing I think it's called Ofori Krom in Kumasi, because that's what the lenders are willing to lend for. Then don't borrow from them. If you know your priorities, okay, stick to them. I once worked on a plantation project in Cameroon, which was, all the management was white. And on the World Bank side, I was the only black face. On their side, there were no black faces at all. And in the middle of the discussion, the leader of the World Bank side asked the managing director of the plantation, well, now you have 4 plantations scattered around. I think you need a plane. I can buy you a plane. And he bought a plane in that project. The tragic thing is that the managing director, who used to pilot the plane himself, eventually died in a plane crash. It is a tragic story. Tragic. But it wasn't the country. It was some technicians from abroad, all French, who decided between them that it's okay, the project can support a plane. So they bought the guy a plane. It's absurd.
Good evening, Yao. Do you believe that independent research organizations like yours do need to depend on development aid to be financed?
Yeah, Theo Network, like many of the big policy research and advocacy organizations, get the bulk of their funding from outside. What it points to really is that whilst a lot of local private sector organizations do undertake charitable work, they tend to focus on the more tangible areas, like maybe giving blankets to the psychiatric hospital, providing food at Easter and so on, as opposed to the less tangible end of the scale, which is like supporting research and policy work, which you would find is also a very strong part of private sector charities in places like the US and Western Europe. And what it will be important going forward, actually, precisely as part of having a stronger local control of all aspects of the thing we do, that we begin to see more of local sources of financing for research and advocacy organizations, so that we have a stronger blend of local Ghanaian sources, be it public or private, with whatever resources organizations raise from outside. But for now, I think for the medium term, we can say that organizations like mine definitely will continue to look to like-minded people, because we also need to look at the spectrum of sources. I mean, in the same way that government raises money from a spectrum of external sources, NGOs also raise money from a spectrum of sources. We have historically raised most of our money from like-minded organizations on terms which have allowed us to retain control of the agenda that we set. We don't take money to implement something that somebody has decided. We drop our own program and look for money to implement it. And the same kind of thing also has to be asked in relation to Ghanaian, and African governments. To what extent do we control the terms on which we raise money from outside? I think that control is a critical factor for any kind of relationship of raising money.
Haven't taken the time to explain the relationship between your agency and the development organizations. When do you envisage a time when you would actually perhaps move from the relationship of assistance to one in which you essentially get consulted and get engaged as consultants for projects for which you are paid, as will be done in a normal consultancy arrangement?
These things evolve, and I think a key part of that really has to do also with the domestic political climate. I mean, let's ask, if some companies were seen to set up, say, charitable units, okay, through which they put part of their profit into charitable purposes, and they are giving money to groups who are seen to be critical of the government, would those companies be afraid that they might suffer victimization? I think the question of political climate is quite important in how then people are encouraged to support the fact that you don't need to agree with people to see the value of the work that they do. I mean, some of the sources from which we raise money is not because they agree with every position we take, but they recognize that people doing analytical work and putting ideas out there, it's important for society. Now that is important. In the same way that education is seen as something which is good for society, whether people are studying history or it's literature or science, all of them make a contribution to society. The recognition that ideas and debate have a place. It is part of creating a political culture, if we have that, a political culture which is tolerant of that kind of diversity, okay, then I think also people would be less worried about the risk they run from putting money into the work of organizations who are engaged in critical activity. Because now it's quite safe to set up a soup kitchen at Circle at Easter and feed the homeless, because you are not challenging anybody and you are seen to be doing good But of course, we have to ask, maybe if somebody put money into analyzing the causes of homelessness and proposals are made for remedying homelessness, the soup kitchen may disappear and we have a longer term solution. Okay? But if you put money into analyzing, let's say a Ghanaian private company gives money to, let's say, Third World Network, and our analysis shows that actually the root causes of homelessness are public policy, okay, which means that people are unable to engage in productive activity in the countryside. Let's say trade liberalization is driving people off the land. So they all come into Accra to look for a living. But economic policy is only encouraging those who are producing in a very narrow basket for export. The structural causes of homelessness are not going to be dealt with by annual soup kitchens. They can only be dealt with by a critical engagement that, listen, folks, the economic policies of the country are the causes of homelessness. And as a company who are interested in the homeless, rather than do annual soup kitchens, we'll give X amount to Third World Network or other organizations who are exposing the causes of homelessness, who are making proposals for dealing with homelessness. It may make the people in power look bad, but for society, the result is better than an annual soup kitchen, where people have to go through the indignity of queuing with bowls to get one meal, at Easter, but for the remaining 364 days of the year, nobody feeds them.
Insofar as you work with donors and somehow are dependent on their generosity, do you think that the work you do is in any way compromised by being dependent upon them? And how do you guard yourself against the tendency or the expectation or sometimes the attempt to influence your work because of the old age adage that he who pays the piper calls the tune?
I think that's a simplistic view, okay? I mean, it is true that taking money to support your work, just like aid, depending on the array of conditionality that comes with it, can be damaging. But there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of support. The imposition of conditionality is not necessarily a function of the money coming from outside. You could get money from local sources who could also, influence in a particular way. If you look at the US, where there's a very strong domestic tradition of philanthropy, okay, there are some people, billionaires, who only give money for right-wing causes. They will give money only to right-wing think tanks whose work will support, let's say, the position of the Republican Party or even to the right of the Republican Party. If a kind of left-leaning organization like Third World Network, okay, goes to them for money, there's no chance that they'll give us money. So it's not whether the money is domestic or international which determines whether you'll be subject to conditionality or influence. It really depends, on the charter, okay, and the objectives of the lending organization or of the granting organization. So I think we need to be careful not to have a simple notion that domestic equals good, international equals bad. The terms on which people are giving money and also what the purposes that is being given for is quite important. But if you look at, for example, aid, okay, that comes to government, you can look through a whole spectrum of aid. Okay. Money where people, for example, attach officers to your military for long periods, are running training institutes for your military. It is arguable that actually they are going right into the heart of your state machinery and indoctrinating, the people around your security apparatus. Okay, that's one end. Okay, then there's the kind of aid also which is conditional on you carrying out kind of a range of economic and social policies. It goes right into the heart of your freedom to make your development choices. Okay, at the other end might be long-term, kind of low-interest loans, which are given to you because you've identified that you need to build a road to open up a certain part of the country. Now, that kind of money, it goes into developing a choice that you have made, which increases your economic and developmental freedom. So you can look through a spectrum of kinds of money which a country procures, which are more or less beneficial or more or less conditional. And the same can be said also of how people, NGOs like ourselves, raise money. And we've always been very, very fiercely protective of our freedom, to speak our minds and to work on the issues that we think are important. We've had experiences where people have come and said, oh, we know you are a well-established organization and we are looking for a strong organization to do A, B, C, D. And we said, no, we don't do that. Because the question for us remains whether organizations like Third World Network, we identify issues that we think are important for our people and the development of our countries and raise money to work for realizing those goals. Or when somebody comes and says, oh, we think that developing primary education will be the best thing for Ghana as opposed to tertiary education. And we are looking for groups who will promote it. And then we say, okay, we'll take your money. At that point, really, you are kind of rent an NGO. It's a form of prostitution, I'm sorry to say. And it's important. And our governments also do prostitute at times in taking donor money without sensitivity to the national interest. So we need to look at these things in their complexities and their nuances.
What specifically do you think we should do, Yao, to wean ourselves away from aid dependency to give real meaning to Nkrumah's words that a black man is indeed capable of running our own affairs?
Well, I think the question of weaning of aid, again, we have to approach by breaking what is put together in this aggregate as aid into kind of its categories, okay, and then approach them. I think in talking about weaning the country of aid, what is important is what concerns most people every day. The fact that certain kinds of aid allow external institutions and other powers to dictate the development choices that the country makes. So that currently, for example, given the size of the country's deficits, the IMF has issued a big report on Ghana and has put out conditions under which it will lend money. So all these things we are seeing about, tariffs on utilities, what kind of how government budget is to be managed, all are part of the conditionalities that come with that kind of aid. Okay, so that kind of intrusive aid has been a very present part of our history, certainly since 1966, because the coup makers, the first thing they did was basically throw themselves into the arm of the IMF and World Bank and the West and said, help us. And they took control, of this country's economy, in very sharp contrast with the refusal of the Nkrumah government to accept, some of the demands that the IMF made, which were responded to publicly, but which the soldiers, backed by, some of the more respected figures of Ghanaian economic policy, were ready to accept. So that kind of aid that leads to control is a key. And I think that if you look at our recent experience, I think there are a number of things that affect this. There is a history on the kind of broader, more fundamental level. The cyclical problems of Ghana's economy, which have to do with our export commodity dependence. When the prices of commodities are good, and this country, which is so heavily dependent on imports, is able to buy the imports that it needs, then we have a lot more room for maneuver. Okay? The worst times in our history where donors have had influence have been when commodity prices have gone down, import prices have gone up, and that situation has been compounded by domestic mismanagement. So in the long term, moving away from a dependence on a small basket of export crops that are not processed, which like gold, cocoa, and a few things, and importing virtually everything we consume, that structural shift is key to our long-term ability to have control over our economic affairs and therefore reduce aid dependence, which also means that neglected areas like domestic food production, manufacturing, require attention. But that's a medium long-term thing. In the near term, I think the management of the economy is quite important, because I think it's quite incredible that because of the mismanagement of the transition to the single spine, together with the mismanagement of public expenditure, together with, say, just the shortfalls in revenue collection, you end up with such a large deficit that you have to turn to donors to fill the gap. And then they get the power to control, what you do in terms of your economic choices, and therefore the lives of all Ghanaians. So if you take those elements, the ways in which revenue, the strategy of public expenditure, because you see, the public expenditure issue, there are questions of how much is spent and the quality of spending. I think we have problems on both the quantity and the quality of spending. There's a lot of spending which really is difficult to understand. Yesterday, I was listening to a discussion in Parliament, and they were talking about a particular expenditure. Say, it says more money, the opposition claimed that more money was spent on something called capacity building than was spent on agriculture. Now, what on earth is capacity building? If agriculture is the most kind of important productive sector of the economy in terms of employment, incomes, you would think that there will be a serious attempt to spend so that the growth in that sector would lead to the kind of structural shifts that I'm talking about, and therefore improve revenue and therefore the dependence on external sources. So how expenditure is organized. And of course, connected here are questions of corruption. Okay? And then also comes revenue generation. Okay? Now, I think the tax base is so narrow. Okay? And it could be diversified. But the thing is that production also increases. The sources of foreign exchange will improve. In recent times, oil has been added to the portfolio of the sources of foreign exchange. Really, if you look at that, it has tremendously improved our ability to control our destiny. Secondly, if we also improve the terms on which we give out concessions for mining our minerals, we should be getting a lot more revenue from our mineral resources and other natural resources than we are getting now. So the revenue side can improve in just these critical areas. But even as we are engaged in this improvement, I think things are happening anyway which are going to make it more and more difficult for the country to receive the kind of aid which we have taken for granted over the years. I'm talking about the fact that once you become a middle-income country, you are no longer eligible for certain kinds of soft money that actually are the type that I would have thought we should have retained the ability to get. Let me explain. When you take away this kind of aid, which is so heavily conditional on economic policy shifts that are dictated to you, there are things like the long-term, low-interest loans that you can get from the World Bank through the International Development Association window, okay, or from the African Development Bank's Africa Development Fund, and a number of other kind of soft loans. Those are given to developing countries. So both China and India, for the longest time, were among the biggest recipients of money from those windows. Because that's the kind of money you can use to build your infrastructure and improve your productive capacity. Now, if you become a middle-income country, you are going to be graduated out of access to those kinds of things. So I don't know what kind of thinking was going on with our policy makers, anytime they are blowing their horn about middle income, because this middle income thing is a statistical aggregate, which when you break down, the structure of this Ghanaian economy is still the structure of a developing country. So, it's a bit strange that it seems to me there's a bit of confusion there. But there are also other areas which are not very visible. The amount of money that comes, for example, for the training of our technocrats and our security agencies from outside, certain forms of cooperation, which actually allow other powers to penetrate into the heart and the orientation of your state machinery. I think those kinds of things must be priority for us to get ourselves out of. But, even the richest countries, there are areas of soft support, whether in education, whether some emergency and so on. Those kinds of things always will continue. Okay? So I think we can't talk about weaning ourselves off in a straight line discussion. There are elements which have greater significance for our political economic freedom. There are some kinds of ways actually which, if you are tactical, you get access to. It strengthens your ability to develop your economy, like the soft long-term loans that you can use for infrastructure and so on and so forth. You listen to a discussion in Parliament. Okay, I had an interview with the Public Affairs Director of Parliament talking about a plan for Parliament to set up a structure so that they can, scrutiny committee, so that they can better evaluate contracts. Very good idea. And then he talks about, we'll go to the UK House of Commons to get support for this. Immediately, I could smell aid. So I'm saying that on even the smallest things, there's an aid mentality within our elite. So the strategic thinking which is needed to say that, listen, we want to get out of aid because we want to have control of our own destiny. That strategic planning is not there. You see, and there have been experiences in other places. When the Asian financial crisis took place in the mid-90s, because, and also the Latin American financial crisis also in the 90s, those countries came back under the tutelage of the IMF, and they told themselves, never again, because we want to be free to make our mistakes. This is something Nkrumah said. It is better to have independence with danger than servitude in tranquility. Our ruling elite of all political hues love this servitude in tranquility. Because donors also, Ghana is a model economy, Ghana is a model democracy, and the aid keeps coming. And it also deflects their accountability to we the electorate. But the Asians and the Latin Americans said, we don't want anybody to be giving us instruction about how to run the economy. So they develop strategies, both in terms of their domestic economic policies and also in how they develop their foreign reserves. So that come anything, they can dip into it to pay for it. Okay? So they decided that we want to run our own. China, even when they were borrowing from the World Bank's IDA to build roads and kind of cheap credit to build infrastructure, they were building up their reserves to the point where China's reserves now is more than $1 trillion. Okay? So I'm talking about the need to have a strategy which is multifaceted to say that certain kinds of aid does not impinge on our freedom to make choices. And we are entitled to it anyway, so we'll take it and use it to reinforce the strategy that we've taken. But if you run your economy in such a way that you end up going back for conditional money, then you are sacrificing your sovereignty. Okay? But I'm saying that our elite, many of them actually don't have any problems because they are quite proud to say that the IMF approves of what we are doing. The British approve of what we are doing. We are doing this in collaboration with the EU and so on. That is a problem. That one is a shift in mentality, which also is a precondition actually for thinking through what kinds of things from outside, which is not direct commercial borrowing, that we want to access to as a financial input. Because all countries are looking for financial input from outside, whether it's commercial borrowing, whether it's soft money, whether it's one-off grants and so on and so forth. But you must be clear. So if Bill Gates comes and says, we'll give you money for malaria control, but you have to take this medicine from this company, let's just say, you have to ask yourself whether actually it will interfere with the development of your domestic pharmaceutical industry. Those kinds of choices. But many times, those things don't enter the discussion.
We've concluded our discussion of from handout to handshakes. After 2 episodes of discussion, I think we better understand the left side of the equation, the handouts bit. We have not fully understood nor really grappled with the second part of the equation when we shall achieve handshakes. But at least, I hope, at the end of these 2 programs, viewers and listeners better understand the business of international development, what it sets out to do, what's in it for us, how we measure the usefulness of what is given to us, and began the conversation as to the path we must follow to ensure that we don't just pick up the crumbs from the tables of the developed countries, but begin to also bake our own bread so we can put it on the table and share it with our former colonial masters who have become our development partners, so that the partnership may be real, because each shall benefit from the contribution of the other. Thank you for being with us tonight. We shall be back next week. Good night.